Hello, and we are live. This is the Freedom Anarchist News Review. Tonight I'm joined by Andy Micah and Rhiannon Firth. Thank you very much for joining me. And tonight we have a solid list of stuff to go through, including Keir Starmer and Labour's latest anti-migrant policy making, which obviously is something of a panicked reaction to the results of the local elections. We've got Trump headed the other direction, coming up with a bunch of policies which seem to be aimed in a more leftward direction, including taxing the rich, which is surprising. We've got the resumption of solidarity pickets, otherwise known as mega pickets, according to the latest in Birmingham. And we have a legal update coming from Andy on the many court cases which have been coming up over the last while, related to obviously the general crackdown against protest and dissent that we've been seeing over the last couple of years. So with no further ado, we can probably start off with the Labour's latest shameful episode, in which obviously there's been talk of making migrant rules much more stringent, increasing the difficulty of the language barriers, and most notably the use of what appeared to be or could be considered mirroring language to the Enoch Powell's River's Blood speech. Andy and Rhiannon, what historical background do you have to the Enoch Powell speech, and what are your views on whether Keir Starmer actually meant to say something like that as a dog whistle towards the far right, and B, what do you think the actual consequences of that, both that as a strategy and the harshening of migrant rhetoric could have? Starting with Andy, sorry.
Okay, yeah. Um, I had to go and reread the Powell speech because I haven't looked at it in about 30 years when I was at university doing politics. Um, and I suppose we can say it's lucky he didn't use words like pickaninnies that are in the original Powell original. Um, the I just don't think that there is any deliberate connection because Starmer's speechwriters are too young and too lacking in the knowledge to have checked something like that. What it does remind you of, though, is, and I'm no great fan of his at the time, Ted Heath sacked the man on the spot um, for um, for being basically a racist, and that shows the way that at the time when racism was as a general concept far more prevalent in British society, that politicians were braver then than now in willing to stand up for common decent values and against prejudice, even a Tory leader like Ted Heath, than a Labour leader is willing to indulge the far right now. And that is quite shocking.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Rhiannon, do you
Yeah, I'm not sure on this one. I mean, I didn't see the Starmer speech, but I am worried about his policies on immigration for my sector. I work in a university, and I've seen his policies for restricting student visas as just being a massacre on the university sector, really. I mean, he seems to have a lot of popular support in a lot of polls and so on. People don't see a problem with what Starmer was saying, which terrifies me more than anything, I think. He's talking about an island of strangers. I've felt for a long time I live on an island of strangers when I look at the views of the general population.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like if they were going to start worrying about alienation, perhaps they should have done that several decades ago and looked directly at the rest of the population. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, I mean, it's been very notable that in the wake of him saying it, uh, regardless of whether it was a mistake or not, the like social media has been absolutely covered. Every post related to it, everything talking about migration has been covered in stuff saying Enoch was right all along, essentially. So, regardless of whether they meant it, the
Really? Where have you seen that? I feel like our algorithm
I mean,
for echo chambers might be a bit different.
Mm.
well, yeah, I mean, so I do tend to watch things like oh, Joe, politics, all that kind of stuff, like the kind of the more mainstream stuff. Anything, particularly anything under the BBC social media posts will be absolutely rife with it because
Yeah.
that's where an awful lot of them go to
Go
complain.
on,
But
yeah, don't read the
um,
comments.
yeah, no, I mean, as a mental health issue, I think not reading the comments is probably quite a good plan. But I tend to try, I do try and like gently keep up with sort of where these conversations are, and it's definitely a case that while it doesn't necessarily make the country more racist as a whole, what it does do is totally embolden racists to shout even louder than they were and say what had been a quiet part out loud. You know, most milder brands of racist have tended to steer clear of saying directly stuff like Enoch Powell was right all along. Um, and have just stuck to, reform is going to do something about the migration problem, and the hotels are full of refugees and things which they can make more of a kind of this is just a news item that I'm discussing argument rather than I think that famous racist was right. Um, but I think there's quite a lot of the furor over the actual phrasing is largely missing the point. Um, because it's not really about whether or not he said something analogous to an Enoch Powell quote. It's about the entire content of what he was saying. It's the, I mean, as Andy was saying, it's this thing where saying things about refugees coming into the country who, are not sort of wild alien beings who we should be terrified of, etc., etc. But making the case that they are is moving the famous Overton window, right? It's moving where our conversation is
Yeah.
further and further into extremity. Um, and it traps Labour as well. One of the things I think is astonishing about the fact that they even did it is that Labour has been chasing racism further and further down this path for the last 10 years plus, with the interregnum of Corbyn. And all that's happened is that the people who want to vote for the most anti-migrant party will continue to vote for reform because reform has adopted and has the mantle of the most anti-migrant party. All that happens when Labour abandons its prior kind of lightweight and self-serving position on multiculturalism being good is that it makes itself out to have been a liar in the first place. It says that reform were right all along, and it can't then go back to multiculturalism because everyone will just be like, well, you've now said the opposite. So you're lying. You're 100% lying, whatever you do. So they've sorted themselves up, let alone the country as a whole. I do not, you know, I think it speaks volumes to the poor quality of the people who are currently running the show at Labour, actually, that they made a schoolboy error, which has also damaged the country. It's not even a self-serving error; it's just an error that has damaged the conversation in Britain.
I mean, one of the classic arguments we get as anarchists against us is you've got no hope of persuading everyone to become an anarchist. You should adopt a more reformist position so that you can get more support and actually do something. And our reply to that has always been that if you shift right, everything else shifts right. So if there was no anarchists on the left, then the left of the Labour Party would be the right of the Labour Party, the right of the Labour Party would
Yeah.
be the Lib Dems, and the Lib Dems would be the Tories. And when you, there are always in politics some compromises to be made. But if you, Starmer has burned stuff that he was saying 5 years ago, totally, and it shows him not only as lacking political nous, but clearly exposing he's thrown any principles he had under the bus just to be hanging on to power, and that looks bad to the voters because people tending towards the reform or right wing view are not going to trust him. So he has got no hope in gaining their votes because they know that he's lying and he would lie one way or the other in order to try and cling on onto power, and is in a desperate situation looking forward to the next election. That he and his backbenchers must be shitting themselves at the moment because they are all going to lose their jobs unless something radical changes.
Yeah, no, it's because ultimately, whatever else you say about Farage, he has been consistent on the topic of migration in a way that we completely disagree with. But what you can't say is that he spent the last 5 years or 10 years or even 20 years moving from one direction to another and back again, depending on where he feels the political wind is. It's when you see Starmer and co saying reform is comprised of liars, it's like, who are you to say that? You've quite thoroughly shown that you are also liars. Um, I mean, it's one thing that I think the anarchist position continues to have in this situation, which Labour has now thoroughly abandoned, is its own internal consistency. And I think that that's something which, it's good for, I was going to say fortunate, but this is part of our politics, right? Is that we don't have to align to positions that we don't actually hold under those circumstances. And we can maintain a level of principle that carries us through. And yeah, I think it's more important now than ever in terms of making the arguments that the Liberals are now abandoning wholesale.
I mean, this has always been the argument about what liberals do, hasn't it? I mean, this has always been the anarchist critique of liberals that they, do just pander to whatever the historical whims are that keep capitalism running or whatever. I mean, they're not doing anything that anarchists weren't saying they were doing already 100 years ago or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, as a thing that kind of goes on to the old mutual aid projects sort of during COVID was that one of the things that you saw obviously was uh, initially the general public being very impassioned and enthusiastic about getting involved in it, and then all of a sudden a flurry of local councillors and MPs all kind of charging in at this thing, which looked like it might have a political impact, but with no actual idea of what mutual aid really entailed. Just an attempt to kind of astroturf their own position on it under those circumstances.
Mm.
And, in the same way as our response to that was an incredible level of cynicism over what the MPs and councillors actually intended. It's the same thing from the other direction when you have someone who is a supporter of reform and someone who has, significant concerns in inverted commas over migration, is that when Labour suddenly jump on this on the grounds that, oh, this is a popular position, there's no sense of connectivity there. There's no understanding of where that position actually comes from, and hence no ability to talk to it and the people who hold it properly. Um, but on a segue from that, we can move on to the next topic, which is Trump leading the way on left-wing policies in America, which is not a sentence I thought I would be saying this year. The basic story of it being that he's basically picked up a couple of Bernie Sanders' old policies, including slashing US drug prices, potentially imposing additional taxation on the rich, which is a real eye-opener, and generally going after price gouging. And this is a story from the FT, in which various kind of left-leaning types are saying that Trump is realizing that these things are popular and he likes to be popular, and the economy has fallen into a rut, and therefore he is essentially in the other direction, chasing policies that are not his own. Which is an interesting one from the perspective of the left, where having your shoes stolen by the far right is a potential issue. I mean, in terms of like how we as anarchists deal with these kinds of attempts to co-opt our projects when they become popular. Are there any sort of historical instances or strategies that are worth kind of bearing in mind for when this sort of thing happens? I'll ask that one to Rhiannon, because I know you've done quite a lot of work on.
Not so much of a historian, to be honest. Can you repeat the question? I'll try and think of the sort of theoretical.
So essentially, I mean, like specifically to things like crisis things in sort of crisis reactions rather, and sort of how mutual aid builds up very quickly, and kind of how our projects can often become very popular in a short space of time, and then have attempts to co-opt or capture them from, you know, political sources like Trump, like Labour when it came to COVID and mutual aid. So you end up with a kind of simultaneous problem of having to try and organize in a crisis, but also kind of either stave off or utilize the intermittently well-meaning but more usually self-serving approaches of the state, I suppose, and certainly kind of that wing of things, state-centric organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose like that's the very nature of the state and anarchism. And I think like one of the things that appeals to me most about anarchism, aside from what you said, well, I mean, very much what you said earlier about how it has an internal consistency and it doesn't sort of have to compromise its own values in a way, but also the fact that part of that internal consistency is due to the fact that anarchism can absolutely survive without the state, but the state can't survive without anarchism. And it's like, you know, capital can't survive without human labor. And things like mutual aid, you know, that mutual aid can occur in any society, you know, whether it has a state or not. But the very nature of the state and capital is to try and capture that. You know, the state will try and recuperate it into an alienating discourse where it posits itself as kind of necessary. You know, it can't have people existing without it because it's kind of a dead force. It's like a state, you know, it has to slot people into roles that are alienating in order to exist because that's its very function. And capital has to profit off, you know, human endeavors and so on because it couldn't exist without that. So I suppose the very nature of the state and capitalism is that when, you know, human movements begin, it's going to try and find a way to capture and commodify them. I suppose that's what anarchists have tended to find difficult to resist, but I think that's partly, well, I mean, yeah, there's also like there's a distinction between anarchy and anarchism. You know, anarchy is when people do what humans do, which is look after each other in a crisis. And then anarchism is sort of trying to build a consciousness about that being ethically desirable. And I suppose part of the anarchist job is to sort of raise consciousness about the fact that when the state then comes along and says, oh, this is great, here's some money to do this, but there's some conditions attached, that I suppose that needs to be treated with suspicion.
Hmm.
I'm not
Yeah.
sure if I'm rambling a little bit. It's not very news.
No,
Maybe it is.
I mean, it
I mean,
connects to
Trump's got very nationalist point on this. The drugs one, he's going to get it paid for by basically shifting the higher prices of drugs elsewhere. And he's also, because he's leader of the United States, the greatest of all the capitalist powers, he's less threatened by the prospect of all the super rich people moving elsewhere. They can't move in the same way that they can debunk from a smaller country that tries to up taxes. So he's in a more privileged position. But what we will say about that is that essentially he might be appearing to help the American working class, but in fact, he's in general working against the global working class, and we will be emphasizing the need for international solidarity because countries can't get out of the global crisis by themselves, which Trump's going to find in the end.
Yeah, I think yeah, I mean in terms of the policy making, it's an interesting one that I think, obviously Trump's doing it in part to try and claw back popularity, but the way in which it's sort of being done is, as you say, it's kind of offsetting to a degree the issue in a way which again sort of takes it out of the hands of working people. And this tends to be the capitalist solution to everything, right? Is it'll take a real issue that maybe working people are starting to gear up towards having or taking direct action on. So, obviously in terms of drug prices and medical issues, you've got the very palpable recent history of Luigi Mangione taking the most directive action, which obviously scared a lot of people. And then you have kind of, all right, so this is an issue, and in the same way as riots have the same effect, right? As does mutual aid during crisis. All of these things are taking the direction of events out of the hands of the ruling class, and you have panic reactions to it, in which either the ruling class oppresses and represses, usually in the case of riots, but also it takes action to solve the issue or semi-solve the issue, as to take the sting out of it in terms of social rebellion. One of the things, and I think Keir Starmer's acts have also a kind of a general lean towards this, right? So that in the wake of the Southport riots, you obviously have serious repression, but you also then have a switch towards much harsher language on migration, which we're continuing to see roll along now, which is to a great degree designed to take, not in a mutual aid way, but in a people roaming the streets beating up migrants way, to take the initiative out of the hands of people at a grassroots level. So there you go. That's a linking up of what Trump is doing, I suppose, with what Keir Starmer is doing, just in different
do you not think
directions.
there's a more direct link in this kind of cozying up in a trade relationship, and the Anglo-American so-called special relationship has always been about being sort of friendly bedfellows and copying each other's discourse and so on.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so if we move on to the next one, so we have, I'll go to Reclaim the Streets Rides Again, which is a story which is up on the Freedom website, which is a retrospective. It is Reclaim the Streets 30th anniversary on May 17th, and there will be a event which is due. Where is the event happening? Oh, it's still, yes, it's to be announced on their Telegram channel, which you can find on our website. But yeah, if I don't know whether either of you want to have a talk about Reclaim the Streets. I missed it, not because I was not old enough to go, but because at the time I was not particularly politically aware, so I was not terribly active or doing anything.
I went to a Reclaim the Streets in Leicester in I think about 1997. It might have been 1998, I'm not sure. And a lot of my friends were involved in the sound system, and somebody put a tripod in the middle of the street on Evington Road in Leicester and held up the sort of busy road all day. And it was brilliant. We had a party and there were kids and there was a real community feel, and people in the neighbourhood came out. And it was interesting because a lot of the people that were involved were sort of kind of ravers that maybe people in mainstream society would have seen as, you know, undesirables or something like that. But for some reason, the Reclaim the Streets ethos really seemed to capture the sympathies of the local community, I suppose. And then the police captured an amplifier or some, oh no, generator. They captured a generator. So there was a sound system. Police took the generator, and then there was this shop called the Pick and Pay Shoe Bar, and he sold shoes, obviously, but I always remember the weird name. And the guy in the Pick and Pay Shoe Bar let us use his electric for the rest of the day after the police took the generator. So, yeah, I have very fond memories of Reclaim the Streets nearly 30 years ago. Yeah, about 26 or whatever it was years ago. Yeah, and then I've been to a few of them in London, and you know, these happen in every city really, Leicester, Nottingham. But I haven't, you know, obviously it's not happened for a very long time now. It's going to be the 30th anniversary, isn't it? But yeah, that's the era that I remember them being, is like 26 years ago or something like that. I don't know how often they happen, but I know that Critical Mass, which I do participate in regularly still, is going to be joining Reclaim the Streets.
Oh, cool.
So I think, you know, there's something going on anyway, so I've heard.
Yeah, I don't, were you active around the time, Andy?
Yeah, I got involved in Reclaim the Streets in London. Well, I went on the M41 thing in '97, and I got involved shortly after that. And so the first one that I was involved in organising was the twin North and South London ones in '98, and then I sort of May Day Tube Party in '99, and shortly after that, one of the more experienced people in Reclaim the Streets came up to me and he said, "Andy, you've always been a good facilitator and at meetings, but it's only when you organise that tube party that we really trust you to be part of the logistics group for this big action that we're going to pull off." And that was Jim Sutton Boulding, the copper, uh, who invited me into the illegal activity. So yes, it was a strange time. But yeah, an extremely, um, as Rhiannon has said, a popular cultural thing, good for the community, moving forward into very radical politics that was explicitly anti-capitalist and anti-state, and you get that in I suppose the highlight for me, the J18 carnival against capitalism in the City of London.
Yeah.
And then that pretty much, Reclaim the Streets is a big player in May Day 2000, but that point the repression really starts to hit it. A lot of people are tired and burnt out, but we get the constant police surveillance. We get the kettling of big groups, then Reclaim the Streets itself as a major party organizer and being very London centric here, pretty much dies in 2000, 2001. So by 2001 May Day, there is a separate May Day collective that's sort of carrying that on. And of course, we get hit by 9/11 the following year. That happens on the day of the Dicey Arms Fair the East End, which is a very strange experience. Chief Inspector Caldwell came up to me and said, "Oh, it's terrible, Andy. That it puts it all in perspective, doesn't it?" And then he saw some protester he didn't like and went and kicked them up the arse. So yeah, I don't have a great time for that. But yeah, very formative experience for me because I've been involved in very small anarchist groups. I was part of the Anarchist Federation. I was in a local anarchist group in Durham, and suddenly I was involved in planning and doing things with thousands of people, and it was great. And I wish we could return to those days as soon as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I got involved. So the first big march I went on was the million-person march to stop the war in Iraq, and then I started getting more political after that. So I missed that whole phenomenon by a couple of years, I think. But it was very much when I started getting involved. Obviously, most of the people in the anarchist who were still active in the anarchist movement were coming straight off the back of that. And there was a really weird sense, I mean, particularly going via freedom, which had kind of itself largely missed out on quite a lot of that stuff by dint of being kind of thought of as a bit of a backwater of the movement at the time and a bit sort of stayed, I think. Was there was this palpable sense of exhaustion going on from the people who were kind of left knocking about, but still a clear residual strength. So you could still go to kind of big squat parties where loads of political people would show up on Commercial Road and all that kind of jazz. But the people who were there were kind of everything seems to be in the process of or has fallen apart, and we're not quite sure what to do and all the rest of it. But reading through the histories, as you go along and sort of hearing the stories, there's this really interesting thing of kind of there's a clear build-up, right? So you go through the 19 or from 1984 through the 1990s. You've got things like the rise of punk, and you've got the road protest movement, and you've got the poll tax riots, and you've got kind of lots of groupings that are kind of knocking about and growing up, but it all then kind of detonates around that kind of sort of reclaim the streets, critical mass, J18 kind of thing, and suddenly becomes absolutely enormous. And it seems to come from nowhere, but there's, sort of reading the historical background, there is kind of a build that then goes broad, where you've got kind of connections in various communities, and the communities know people, and then when it starts to happen, everyone's like, "This is a party, but also a protest, so it's fun, but also I kind of know people and they're nice." So you can kind of, from an outsider's perspective, you can kind of look at it from afar and be like, I can kind of see why this did so well. This has a clear modus operandi, which is very attractive to normal human beings, as opposed to kind of political obsessives. um, but yeah, I don't know whether any of that kind of rings bells with how you saw things from the inside, I suppose.
I think very much that you sometimes read an account and not particularly criticizing the article published in Freedom that says there was political development in Reclaim the Streets. A lot of that was because people from anarchist traditions went into Reclaim the Streets and shoved it in the right direction. And that was always an ongoing battle as it became popular. You got more people who had just reformist politics and thought it was a great thing coming in. So you're constantly having to fight to keep it more political, more activisty, and particularly after May Day 2000, there was a big reaction of people saying, "Let's go back to our anti-car roots." rather than forward to a sustained campaign against capitalism as a whole. But yeah, great times. Have a wonderful amount of fun. Admittedly, I didn't get nicked for any of it. But
Always a
times
win.
were easier then. Our worst sentence was 4 years for someone hitting a cop over the head with a spade. Uh,
Yeah, I mean,
bless his heart.
the sentencing alone has made trying to organise things ridiculously difficult comparatively. It hasn't been of any surprise to me that there's been a parallel rise of direct action groupings where either the prospect of arrest and jail time has essentially ceased to be a motivating factor, or where they do things, you know, undercover, where they know that if they, they do things which are like Palestine Action are doing things which can get them sent down for lengthy stretches. And it's like, well, if your fluffy protest is going to get you sent down as much as your more hefty one, then why not do the more hefty one? Like, it's an obvious piece of logic. It's an odd one, I think, that Starmer and Co. haven't quietly lowered the degree to which they're repressing fluffy protest, because it doesn't seem to do them many favors in the long run not to, if you see what I mean. This leads us, I suppose, fairly appropriately onto the legal update as well, where we have various court cases ongoing.
Well, the one that you particularly bring up is the last Tory government brought in changes to the conditions that the police could impose on demonstrations. So that instead of the serious disruption to the community, it was reduced to any disruption that was more than minor, and things like just making a lot of noise could be seen as the serious disruption. And when they passed that, they failed to get it through the House of Lords because too many doddery old lords happened to be ex-judges and pointed out the many impracticalities and ridiculousness in it. And so the Tory government got round that by passing what's called a statutory instrument after being defeated in the Lords. And our good old friends Liberty, formerly for older viewers the National Council for Civil Liberties, took a judicial review of this, and last week they won, surprisingly, in the Court of Appeal. Surprising to me because I expect no good of the Court of Appeal, but we'll come to more of that fun in a minute. And we're waiting to see what this government will do about it. They could try and appeal this judgment to the Supreme Court, or, given their massive majority in Parliament, they could just pass through the legislation again. Or they just might say that was a really bad idea by the last government and we'll scrap it, as someone has just pointed out, because it really isn't doing them a power of good. And of course, the sort of demonstrations that it was useful for controlling were the Extinction Rebellion ones, where no one did anything of great disruption anyway, and were all peaceful. So that's one we're sort of waiting to see. You've also covered my other initial point, which is Palestine Action, whose troubles get more serious. Another 10 have been charged with aggravated burglary, which is ordinary burglary, but you've got to have a weapon of offence. There's already 18 people facing trial for the Filton Arms Factory in Bristol. The next 10 are for an arms factory in Kent, of which the weapon of offence appears to be fireworks that they fired over the fence, which doesn't sound like it's very, very bad, but the prosecution alleging that there's 500,000 litres of noxious flammable liquid in the factory that could have been blown up. So they are spinning that for all they're worth. I very much doubt the fireworks could have set that off, as it's contained rather solidly, but you know how they like to exaggerate. So there's sort of things in the pending. But the other one that I thought I'd mention, since it's come up in the last couple of days, is the poor guy who spent 38 years in jail for a murder he did not commit, and the eventually exonerated by DNA evidence only 15 years after the test became available. And and if they say that the wheels of justice grind slow, this is a prize one. I had a little. His case eventually gets referred back by something called the Criminal Cases Review Commission, that is supposed to look into people who later had new evidence come up in their cases. And they got a very helpful website. You can look up the stats. They've been going since 1997. They've had 32,000 applications, of which they've managed to send 2.7% to the Court of Appeal for the judges to actually have a think about. So I think we can probably consider that they're not working too hard for the setting right of all the injustices in this world. Not that I'm saying that the prison should be there for anyone else, but this one is a particularly egregious example of how badly the system works, even compared to how it's supposed to work. And hopefully that will have some positive effect on, if nothing else, how people on juries, when you're sitting on a case, look at evidence and think, this might seem as if it's 100% solid because the cops and their scientists have said so, but there's still a hell of a lot of possibilities of doubt there, because they are just obsessed with getting convictions and not seeing justice done. So that's my legal rant for the week.
I was talking to someone about whether the death penalty should be reintroduced just yesterday. Could have used that argument. But, oh, you have a comment. Love the T-shirt, Andy, from a mutual friend. This is a Ukrainian solidarity type thingy, from what I can tell.
Yes, yeah, bless them. They're still losing the war. So yeah, if anyone can bother to give them some solidarity, I'm sure they'll greatly appreciate it.
Which does bring us neatly to two things I was going to say. One being methods of supporting the Palestine Action prisoners. What would you recommend?
Obviously, those who want to, you can write to them details on Palestine Action's website until that organisation gets prescribed and can as a terrorist organisation, and they're all shut down. The practical elements is pretty much as simple as that. In terms of fundraising, there are some that you will see, but the main cost in these things is for prisoners who need resources, particularly travel expenses for relatives going to visit them. The same applies to the climate protesters who are still inside. And I'll plug Bristol ABC because we still have a lot of the Kill the Bill demonstrators from Bristol a few years back still in jail. So, yeah, if you can support those. In the future, the two really big Palestine actions, of which there are 20 people on remand for at the moment, those trials are being sent to the Old Bailey. because so those of them are still on bail will be facing something like a 2 month trial, we think, and they or their relatives from around the country may need places to stay in London. So closer to the time of action, we will be looking for solidarity, accommodation, and support for putting people up while that goes on, because uh, as I'm sure you can guess, if you turn up late for court or because the trains aren't running properly or and you have to be there at a relatively early hour, the judge will find a way to make sure that you turn up the next morning um, by giving you accommodation at His Majesty the King's expense. Um, I believe there was an announcement today that another 3 big prisons are being built, which shows that the initial reports that the Labour Party will be thinking about a radical reform of use of prisons don't seem to be happening. Starmer again has shat himself in face of right wing pressure on that one. Watch this space. We'll keep everyone updated on what's happening.
With the volunteering to help out when people are coming down to London, is that via GBC or is it an ACAB thing, or how do people get in
We're
touch?
all in the same alphabet soup. But yeah, and it's or direct to Palestine Action. It's probably a little bit early, but we will publicise the stuff. But if people are interested in getting involved in GBC or ACAB, just have a look at the GBC website and you can get in touch with us. Or the email for ACAB is on all the bus cards, which I hope everyone keeps handy, just in case.
If you do not keep them handy, they are available from Freedom Press. You can just walk into the bookshop and grab a handful to hand out to all of your friends at demonstrations. If you want to find the Green and Black GBC stands for Green and Black Cross, and their website is greenandblackcross.org. Which leads us to last couple of bits were, so the Teesside book fair took place was it earlier in this week or was it last week? I can't remember now. The days are all blurring together because May is rapidly turning towards June. Our very own Freedom editor Uri was there and says it was a lovely day out, or said it was a lovely day out. Met a couple of old comrades, including someone who used to volunteer at the Freedom Bookshop. So shout out to them for still coming along to the radical gatherings. It's always appreciated. And we have another stall that we'll be doing will be in Norwich at the end of this week. It's not a radical book fair, but it is an independent book fair at which there will be us and also Theory and Practice. If you know them, they show up to various of the radical book fairs. Very nice people. And that's on the 17th from, I think, 9 a.m. to 5, something like that. So a longish day, actually. On which note, are there any other bits and pieces that people want to plug whilst I'm here, or whilst we're here? And if not, I will say thank you very much to both Rhiannon and Andy for doing the job of showing up and talking on the show for an hour. It's always very much appreciated, and it's lovely to talk to you.